So before I start, I'd like to thank Professor Wiebel for the invitation to come to ZKM. It's the first time I've been here, and it's a really quite wonderful space, so thank you very much. And thank you to all the staff at ZKM as well for making this possible, actually, in terms of all the logistics. Okay. So algorithms are symptomatic of a new stage of capital, a new mode of development that I call computational capitalism. In doing so, algorithms utilize in the material substructure a number of fundamental concepts that structure their operation. These concepts are both operationalized and ideological. Examples include knowledge, efficiency, beauty, and even cool. Algorithms make possible an accumulation regime that relies on the capture of data, its manipulation and exploitation, and the structuring of a new algorithmic subject to these techniques. Software makes possible an economy of variation, generated through heuristics of pattern matching to discover and exploit difference. This economy requires a new subject, which is formed through processes of technical individuation that include socialization into new configurations of thought through algorithmic mediation. In this talk, I explore some of the consequences of this new mode of thinking under conditions of computational capital, but also what is at stake in the creation of a cognitive concrete that is increasingly embedded as infrastructure. We now live within a horizon of interpretability determined in large part by the capture of data and its articulation in and through algorithms. They shape and mediate our direct experience of a system of capitalist exploitation through the automation of innumerable processes. This novel space of experience and meaning creates a new envelope for economic valorization, leading to what I call an algorithmic triangle of surveillance, control, and exploitation. And, of course, subsequently, to new potentials for social conflict. Under these conditions, I want to argue that thought itself is differently organized from previous historical forms. In the case of the algorithmic condition, an ontological gap is created. Thought is suspended and crystallized through interfaces and software that accentuate screnic pragmata. That is, thought is directed to thinking about objects in terms of practice rather than theoretically or critically. So one way of representing this might be through the metaphor of the hanging fishnet, or hammock in English. I believe it's Hangmatte in German. I'm not a German speaker, I'm afraid. This is a canvas mesh suspended from a number of supports. Much like a person resting in a hammock between two trees, the mind of the individual is suspended by an algorithmic net or mesh, which structures and reinforces particular ways of seeing, while still giving the impression of movement, freedom, and creativity. Thought balanced in an algorithmic net is thereby limited in the ways in which it can be directed, as algorithms funnel thinking along decision trees towards decision points and prescribed outcomes. This could be understood perhaps as a type of algorithmic falling. Of course, I'm gesturing towards Verfallen, the Heideggerian concept, reflected in the screnic lives of many people today who have fleeting feelings of alienation in a world of informational overload. Certain modes of thinking are facilitated by this algorithmic net. Critical reason, attention, and the ideas or opinions formed through that process are de-emphasized. Instead, associational ways of thinking are prioritized through concepts of streaming, surfing, or algorithmic reverie. The possibility of thought is prescribed by this net of software that surrounds and envelops the mind, creating a new topology of attention, but also augmenting the human mind in radical ways. Here then lies a question. How much augmentation can the subject experience before thought itself is automated? That is, when is thought anti-thought, exogenous thought, or alien thought? This is a challenge for computational societies, where the automation of thought is also a mental proletarianization, and thereby individual and social liquidation. However, this metaphor of the hammock also suggests a reparative dimension, I believe, through a potential politics of algorithms, by suggesting points of failure and disruption possible through the targeting of these algorithmic supports for the mesh or net. So today I want to explore what it means to think and how is thinking possible under a technical a priori that subverts and reshapes at every turn our traditional understandings of the faculty of thought itself. Whilst, of course, I do not have time to rehearse all the arguments that inform my paper today, I do want to spend some time concentrating on the specific questions raised by computation. In particular, what does it mean to place the cognitive processes of thought within the concrete reality of the infrastructures that surround us? Or to put it differently, what does it mean to infrastructuralize thinking? Or as I prefer to call it, the infrasomatization of thought. Today, in work, action, and intellectual inquiry, we see a growing use of computational systems to abstract, simplify, and visualize complex phenomena, and a tendency towards simplistic causal and statistical models to understand complex social phenomena, such as, for example, Pentland's notion of social physics. Chris Anderson, of course, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this claim, has proclaimed the end of theory, no less, arguing that the data deluge has made the scientific method obsolete. Indeed, he claimed we can stop looking for models. We can analyze the data without hypotheses about what it might show. We can throw the numbers into the biggest computing cluster the world has ever seen and let statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot. And that with enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. These claims reflect the notion of big data, of course, or what we might call a cult of dataism. This is a renunciation of the extended and important role of critical reason and theoretical thinking in modern society. Instead, I want to suggest we might actually use the algorithm as a diagnostic for thinking about how we experience under the conditions of the digital, and how we are affected by computation within our everyday lives in order to raise questions about automation of thought itself. This allows us to explore how algorithms are used as a technique to exercise power and to produce strategic behaviours through their deployment in the management of thought, in infrastructures of communication, for example, and through what I'm calling infrasomatization. So with the concept of infrasomatization, the intention is to expand the categories of exosomatization and endosomatization developed by Alfred Lotka and Nicholas Georgescu-Reagan in their work on ecological economics, and by Karl Popper in relation to what he called objective knowledge. The terms exosomatization and endosomatization have more recently been deployed in the work of course, in Bernard Stiegler, in relation to thinking about human augmentation and digital technologies, particularly in relation to the Anthropocene. The notion of infrasomatization I want to use, though, as a contribution to thinking about the questions raised by these concepts, but also to move away from a binary between endosomatic and exosomatic by introducing a third term. First, I think it might be useful to briefly survey the early uses of these terms. Lotka argued that humans and nature should be understood holistically, particularly to show how human activity had an influence upon the operation of what he called the world engine. For Lotka, what he called exosomatic elements are different from genetic endosomatic organs like arms, legs, or hands. Exosomatic elements are tools and other instruments used by humans to produce, exchange, and consume energy in some form. Exosomatic organs, therefore, are an extension of the natural functions of humans and the upshot of economic production. As he argued, in place of slow adaptation of anatomical feature and physiological function in successive generations by selective survival, increased adaptation has been achieved by the incomparably more rapid development of artificial aids to our native receptor effector apparatus in a process that might be termed exosomatic evolution. Georgescu-Reagan used and developed Lotka's ideas of biophysical economics. He argued that, apart from a few insignificant exceptions, all species other than man use only endosomatic instruments, as Lotka proposed to call those instruments, legs, claws, wings, etc., which belong to the individual organism by birth. Humans alone came in time to use a club, which does not belong to the humans by birth, but which extended the endosomatic arm and increased its power. At that point in time, human evolution transcended the biological limits to include also, and primarily, the evolution of exosomatic instruments, i.e. of instruments produced by humans but not belonging to the body. That is why humans can now fly in the sky or swim under the water, even though they've not evolved wings, fins, or gills. Karl Popper similarly drew from the notion of exosomatization from biology, arguing against Hume that the specificity of human reason is related to the exosomatic process of externalization of reason by writing, which enables the possibility of criticism and thereby of the correction of what he called incorrect inferences. Popper argued that Hume claims that in practice we make inferences on the basis of repetition or habit, a psychology Popper described as primitive. Indeed, Popper further argued that without the development of an exosomatic descriptive language, a language which, like a tool, develops outside the body, there can be no object for our critical discussion, and that through the externalization of language, a linguistic third world can emerge. And it's only in this way, and only in this third world, that the problems and standards of rational criticism can develop. But as Popper was particularly interested in the development of rationality in and through the capacity for the externalization of the processes of communication in language and through the materialization of thoughts in a medium of expression, he argued that instead of growing better memories and brains, we grow paper, pens, pencils, typewriters, dictaphones, the printing press, and libraries. Similarly, Bernard Stiegler has also been deploying these concepts of endosomatic and exosomatic in his more recent work. For instance, he argues that Marx and Engels showed at the beginning of the German ideology that humanity consists above all in a process of exosomatization that pursues evolution no longer through somatic but through artificial organs. He argues further, humankind has discovered to its stupefaction that the exosomatization is now directly and deliberately produced by the market and with respect to the immense transformations to which it gives rise, without offering any choice other than, in the best case, the profitability of investment, or in the worst case, the pure speculation involved in the increasingly tight connection between the casino economy, marketing, R&D conceived according to increasingly short-term and therefore speculative modes of disruption. Today, of course, we have new forms of externalization which complicate, I think, the picture of mere externalization of what has been described by Popper as internal thoughts and ideas made exosomatic. Not only do I claim that computational techniques and technologies differ from previous materializations, but are also troublingly constitutive of and able to frame how those externalizations are made. I haven't the space here to explore the specificities of the materialities of previous mediums and their capacity to shape thoughts and ideas. But I want to highlight the difference of computational forms in their processual shaping and reshaping, or at least gesture, towards the very fluidity of the moment of a new kind of externalization under the conditions of computation. Indeed, I think this can be detected in terms of an anxiety exhibited by a public that has begun to note the automation and datafication of everyday life and the wider effects of a financialized economy, and the resultant claims for the capacity for individuation and for critical thinking. So we can take the very contemporary examples of fake news, and certainly implied by this, the recent manipulation of social media in the election of Donald Trump and the UK Brexit referendum. And of course, I'm referring here to Cambridge Analytica. So I want to claim that algorithms are deployed as what I am calling infrasometizations. That is, they are not just exosometizations, not just the production of tools or instruments. Infrasometizations are rather the production of constitutive infrastructures. Indeed, infrasometizations rely on a complex fusion of endosomatic capacities and exosomatic techniques to create what we might call algorithmic governance, following Burns and Rouvray. So we might consider the way in which infrasometizations differ in relation to the claims made by Popper, for example, for the role of exosomatization in the development or suppression of the capacity for reason and critical thinking, which I believe are very important questions for us today. By infrasomatization, I'm drawing on the Latin infra as meaning below, but also its use in anatomy, where infra refers to below or under a part of the body. Therefore, as I previously explained, infrasomatization does not refer to an instrumental notion of technology, but rather the capacity for framing or creating the conditions of possibility for a particular knowledge milieu. In this sense, certain exosomatizations are actually infrasometizations. That is, when they are built into the lived environment and act to provide context and associations, both material and symbolic. Through the creation of specific infrasomatic formations, temporary or otherwise, new modes of knowing and thinking, assembling and acting can be made possible by bringing scale technologies together to create infrastructures. Infrastructure is commonly understood as the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities, of course. We think of buildings, we think of roads, we think of power supplies. And these are, of course, needed for the operation of a society or enterprise. These are also sometimes understood as specifically social or economic infrastructure and tend to be articulated within a national frame, a sense of a nation state. Indeed, as Parkes argues, the word infrastructure emerged in the early 20th century as a collective term for the subordinate parts of an undertaking, substructure, foundation. That is what engineers refer to as stuff you can kick. Similarly, Easterling argues the word infrastructure typically conjures up associations with physical networks of transportation, communications, utilities. Infrastructure is considered to be a hidden substrate, the binding medium, or current between objects of positive consequence, shape, or law. So, one interesting example of this that really in the very short time I have available, I would like to gesture towards, is the construction of an exospheric technical system. This is made up of a number of orbits around the Earth. Lowest orbiting satellites occupy what's called low Earth orbit, or LEO, which includes any orbit below 2,000 kilometers. Mid and high Earth satellites orbit through the exosphere, higher above this, and can maintain their orbits for decades without adjustment. We're familiar with these. Weather and communication satellites, for example, occupy these higher orbits, and they're able to provide a given view on the planet to carry out and capture data and transmissions, and so on and so forth. At the very top of the high Earth orbit is what is called the Geosynchronous Orbit. Any satellite here has an orbital period the same as the Earth's. And a special type of geosynchronous orbit is the geostationary orbit, which runs along the equator. This keeps the satellite at the same point in the sky throughout the entire orbit. So, for example, the global positioning system, the GPS system, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, is a US-owned organization that provides its various users with positioning, navigation, and timing services. GPS satellites fly in medium Earth orbit at an altitude of approximately 20,200 kilometers above the Earth, and each satellite circles the Earth twice a day. These satellites in the GPS constellation are arranged in 6 equally spaced orbital planes, and each plane occupies 4 slots occupied by baseline satellites. So it's a complete structure that surrounds the Earth, which is in itself a very interesting aspect. So this 24-slot arrangement ensures that users on Earth can view at least 4 satellites from virtually any point on the planet. This takes place due to 31 satellites in a GPS constellation. So GPS, and I'm sure I don't need to explain, is really the essential element of the global informational infrastructure, right? It's one of the key infrastructural aspects that make possible computational capitalism. And GPS, from its very early beginnings, which were essentially military, now is used in farming, construction, mining, surveying, package delivery, logistics, communication networks, banking systems, financial markets, and power grids. They're all heavily dependent on GPS, right? Absolutely heavily dependent. Indeed, some wireless services from phone companies cannot function now without GPS. The GPS is required merely to hold the entire system up. But infrastructure, we might note, is not just the built environment, the materialities, as it were. It's not just the cables and wires, the water pipes, the transport networks, the GPS. It's also the technical a priori, right? And this technical a priori, I want to suggest, is created in and through computation. It's also notable that talk of infrastructure seems to allow us to get a grip on this ephemerality of data and computation, right? This is this turn to the material, I think, and explains in some sense this concentration on the concrete as a concept. And of course, you know, if we look at the language of these computational systems, clouds, streams, flows, you know, we hear about all these kinds of structures that seem so ethereal and distantiated from our everyday life. So my argument certainly is that we do need to think about not just the cables and wires, satellites and receivers, chips and boards, of course, the as it were, sheer thingness of these physical objects, but we also need to consider the stacks and layers, the software and code, the algorithms and patterns, together with the shared standards, diagrams, interfaces and organizational structures, the infrasometizations that are produced by bringing these things together. So here the example that I gave of the exospheric technical system, the GPS system, is helpful as it helps to point to the importance of location, orientation and topology under conditions of computational capitalism. It's not enough for humans to know where they are. Algorithms need to know too. And they need to understand place as much as a formal representation of space made possible by geosatellite triangulation. I think that's a very interesting aspect to this kind of infrasomatization. So infrasometizations can be thought of as social structuring technologies. They have an obduracy that can be mobilized to support specific instances of thought, rationality, and action. Again, think about the processes of thinking through merely moving around the city, right? How it's mediated through these algorithms, but also through the, essentially, GPS system, this exospheric technical system. So infrasometizations are, as it were, latent technologies that are made to be already ready for use, to be configured and reconfigured and built into particular constellations that form the underlying structures for social and psychic individuation. And I think also, rather interestingly, infrasometizations gesture to a kind of gigantism, the sheer massiveness of fundamental technologies and resources, their size usefully contrasting with the minuteness and ephemerality of the kinds of personal devices that are increasingly merely interfaces or gateways to the underlying infrastructural systems. Today we talk a lot about data infrastructures, computational materiality for the highly digital society we live in today, especially raised by those relations in regard to the social organization, social structures, but also, I think, social media. There's something interesting going on there. So the key question for me, and of course I won't answer it, I can merely raise it in this very short time left to me, is how infrasometizations are created as infrastructure. And more particularly, how these new forms of infrastructure are positioned to change or replace existing institutions. This allows us to think about institutions as knowing spaces and how they force us to consider the political economic issues of making institutions, combined with the focus on creating specific epistemic communities within them. That is, I suppose, in some senses, how do infrastructures think? By institution, I'm gesturing towards specific organizations founded for a particular activity. Because of my more recent work, I also tend to focus on the question of the university. So, connecting the knowledge formations, affective and cognitive styles and performances made possible within a particular institution, I think, structured by the particular constellations of infrasometizations deployed, we thereby create, I hope, and I certainly would argue, grounds for a political intervention. So, for example, looking at the work of Andrew Feenberg, he's argued convincingly that a critical theory of technology requires counteracting the tendencies towards domination in the technological a priori through the materialization of values. Thus, we could say we need a kind of tactical infrasomatization. Here, of course, I'm gesturing towards the rich theoretical work on tactical media, which has been extremely important for media activism and theory. Indeed, as Stiegler has argued, the reticulated digital infrastructure that supports the data economy can and must be inverted into what he calls a neganthropic infrastructure founded on hermeneutic digital technology in the service of disautonomization. So, I believe that specific intervention points can be found within this materialization of the technical a priori. For example, in the design processes, but also later in thinking about these nets, these hammocks, and the way in which they support particular cognitive processes, the very condition of thought, as it were. Feenberg argues that design is the mediation through which the potential for domination contained in scientific technical rationality enters the social world as a civilizational project. So by ascertaining how infrasomatization affect knowledge formations, I believe we can work to produce new knowledges and practices that can test particular institutional structures. So the relation between infrasomatization and institutions and infrastructures, I think, is an urgent research question. In my own case, using the metaphor of the fishnet or hammock, I argue that we need to uncover the touch points between thought and algorithms. That is, the algorithmic supports that I gestured towards earlier. These are the connecting points between infrasometizations and the possibility of thought, and a key to understanding how cognitive infrastructures are redrawing the way in which humans think. Understanding the relationship between infrasomatization and organization, and then to the form of institution, is crucial to constructing progressive institutions, I would argue. This provides a possibility of contestation of problematic institutional forms, and particularly of the increasingly computational aspect to them. Hence, we might consider the need for infrasomatic critique and the subsequent possibility for contesting the emerging forms of computational technologies, structures, systems, and processes. Thank you. So I believe there's 5 minutes for questions. Quite hard for me to see up here.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for your talk and for introducing this. What I totally agree. Central question of what does it mean to think in the age of computation, right? I just would like to, if I may, ask a little bit more whether you could tell us a bit more. You said you raised a question, but you didn't have time to answer. But I'm sure you have an indication, especially vis-à-vis the work they've done about university and knowledge systems. What would it be an infrastructure, a computational infrastructure? The one is almost, it seems to me that what you were suggesting, it almost rewires all kinds of media. So you take computation retrospectively to tell us of an old history of media, which it seems to me that you're saying the kind of process of exosomatization is a particular to human culture. And obviously knowledge production is particular to human culture. We can talk about how animals and plants and, within the question of Anthropocene, they retain knowledge, but there's of course something, it seems to me that you're saying it is a bit different from that. Yep. So I would like to know a little bit more about that. Sounds, interesting.
Yeah. So I think you're correct. I mean, exosomatization, and the people who write within that literature are aware of, different kinds of exosomatization. The question is there something specific to the human exosomatization, or perhaps the social condition of exosomatization? And yes, I would argue there is a difference. I mean, that's part of the work I'm doing. I think there's something there about the question of thought. There's something there about the question of understanding and hermeneutics. And there is also something there about the kind of, if I might be kind of Marxian for a second, a kind of species being, right? The question of species being. And these I do very much connect to, or certainly currently, because I'm in the middle of a new book, but I certainly connect these to the project of the university, right? What is a university for? What does a university do? What does a university mean, actually? A fundamental question that I'm trying to address in my new work. And this is timely because there are many arguments today that the university is no longer required, that the internet in some sense can replace the university. We're all very familiar with Peter Thiel paying people not to go to university, right, which is a really rather strange idea. And it's almost sort of suggestive or symptomatic that at the moment in which a university becomes certainly mass and maybe towards the possibility of a comprehensive experience for all humans, that the conditions shift and the university is under real threat. Right? There's something rather interesting going on there and something to be worked through. So linking these things together essentially is to raise the question about, well, what is it in the university? What does it provide? How is it, if you like, infrasomatization? What is it specific to it in relation to thought? And how do questions of computation affect those structures, those classic organizational and pedagogical and research questions that the university was created as a particular kind of functional sector of society, if you like. What is it that's going on here? So, for me, the answer lies through the university, right? And I can't give you a short answer. It's a book. It'll be out next year, and I'm in the middle of writing it. But certainly, that's how I am thinking through this kind of problematic.
Just moving along to the left here.
There you are.
Thanks very much, David, for your talk. So I'm going to just ask a question about your choice of infra, and so therefore where you'd like to make your contribution. And this may seem a little pedantic, but I'm really interested in the preposition and the way in which you take from the idea of the underneath as the space for a kind of technical a priori. And I was just wondering if you were aware at all of Marcel Duchamp's use of the word infra in his concept of the infrathin, which he never was able to really explain. And so he said, you can't explain the infrathin, you can only give examples. And for him, the examples were things like the warmth that one feels from the seat when one stands up, or the feeling of smoke exhaling from the mouth. And so my feeling about Duchamp's concept of the infra there is not so much the underneath, but rather the between or the across. I'm just wondering if something about the between or the across might be important for your thinking as well.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't aware of that reference. That's really, really helpful.
Artists.
That's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And certainly I'll have to think about that. And I particularly like this notion of warmth you gesture towards and the bodily affect associated with it. So I think it's something very interesting there I have to think about. But of course, the between and the across, I think, are, of course, crucially important, right? I didn't have enough time really to fill out how I'm thinking about this concept, and software is a kind of glue. It is a between, as it were, in interesting ways. So, but thank you very much. I think that's a very, very interesting suggestion.
Thank you. So you outlined some developments that are taking place that shape our view on the world, basically also because our way of thinking changes. And what do you think how the perception is influenced by these kind of externalizations? Currently, we tend to even externalize understanding, which undermines critical thinking. Do you think it is then going back to maybe something more experience-driven, as you outlined it, or what do you think is the maybe trajectory we are on right now?
I think you're right. That's a very big question, so I can only really give a small answer. But I mean, these questions of the experience of these technical systems is absolutely fascinating. There's been some very interesting work in phenomenology around this question. I mean, one thing I do find interesting, and one thing I've referred to in my previous work, is the kind of technical design, the diagram, as it were, of the stream. Right, the stream is, in some sense, a new technical a priori, that creates a certain kind of phenomenology, which is absolutely fascinating. It's fleeting, it's surfing, it's you know, moving your phone list down infinitely, a way of engaging with and experiencing a technology that is strangely hollowing, right, of thought, right? And I think that's kind of a really interesting question. I did want to connect that to something. Oh yes, critical reason. You know, what drives my work is the question of critical reason under conditions of computation, right? And I think that's an absolutely fundamental question. You know, I certainly don't want to argue that, you know, computation is just all bad. I certainly don't believe that. But there are particular questions to be asked about the technical a priori and our relationship to it. And I think we have to go through the thinking, and that's the kind of challenge for our times.
Okay, one last question maybe. There's also time for questions at our panel discussion today at 5 p.m.
Thank you very much.